Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're watching us. Have a good rest of your day. I'm Daniel Kamarov. Welcome to my podcast on YouTube. Today, I'm honored to meet with Rabbi Michael Marmur. Rabbi Michael Marmur is a professor of Jewish theology at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, and a member of Board of Rabbis for Human Rights. Born and raised in England, Rabbi Marmur lives in Jerusalem. Dear Rabbi, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Daniel.
Thank you so much. You were born in the UK and then became a rabbi and a well-known scholar living in Jerusalem. How did that come to be?
Well, I was in the family business. My late father, Dov Mama, was a rabbi before me, and I suppose that was my formative influence. That explains the rabbi part, perhaps. The Israel part, well, in the 1980s, I became excited and animated about the possibilities of coming and being part of Israeli society. And that's what I did, as well as Sarah, who was then my girlfriend and is now my wife. So it wasn't a very tempestuous or complicated process. Shortly after I finished my undergraduate studies in the UK, I decided to come and live in Israel, and I've been here more or less ever since.
Thank you so much. That's a great story. In each of my interviews, I tell a Jewish joke to emphasize like a point or an idea. And I also have one today. In effort to better understand his Jewish constituents, the mayor reached out to a popular rabbi. The rabbi invited the mayor to spend Shabbat at his home, and the rabbi made Kiddush, the blessing, on Friday night on a full cup of wine. During dinner with fish, they made a lachaim, a toast to life, on some fine scotch. The main course came with Israeli wine. The next day, they made Kiddush over wine at the synagogue. And the next after the service, they ate crackers with herring and made a l'chaim. They went home, and the rabbi made kiddush for his family on another cup of wine, a single malt with the cholent, the stew, and it got dark, and then another cup of wine that was used for Havdalah. And the mayor said to the rabbi, I had a wonderful time. Thank you for allowing me to share Shabbat with you. I still don't get why you can't turn the lights off, but I do understand why you don't drive. This story
Nice.
this story shows that the rabbi was unable to properly explain Shabbat to the mayor, showing how Jews celebrate without really explaining why. As a scholar and a world-known expert on Rabbi Abraham Joseph Heschel, please tell us about this man. How would Heschel explain Shabbat to the mayor?
Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was born in Poland in 1907 in Warsaw. As a teenager, he left the confines of his Hasidic household. First of all, he went to Vilna and from there to Berlin, and found himself from the late 1920s in Berlin. That is to say, during the rise of Nazism, he was living in Germany. He was repatriated to Poland in 38, which was the Nazi policy of the time. And thanks actually to the Hebrew Union College, which is the institution where I work, it was possible for him to leave Europe. He came, first of all, to London for a year or so at the outbreak of the war, and then was in America for the rest of his life, first of all in Cincinnati, which was the main campus in those days of HUC, of the Hebrew Union College. And thereafter, from around the time of the end of the Second World War, at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. He was a very influential scholar, thinker, teacher, and he wrote a series of books which to this day are still amongst the central works of American Jewish creativity. Perhaps his most famous book, certainly one of them, is called The Sabbath. And if you like, it would be an attempt to explain, without the benefit of all of that alcohol, to explain something about the essence of Shabbat. Heschel describes it less from the perspective of halachic rigor, that is to say, the dictates of Jewish law, and more tries to strike at the essence of the concept of Shabbat. He makes a distinction between the realm or the dimension of space and the dimension of time, and he suggests that technological, 20th century humanity is overly besotted by things in space, by stuff that we own, things that we have. And Shabbat is a call to rebalance and recalibrate and to remind ourselves that we live in the dimension of time, that in fact the most consequential things, the most significant, the lasting things, if you like, live in that dimension of time. So he, I think, would have a pretty good chance of explaining to the mayor something more profound about Shabbat.
Thank you so much. So he described Shabbat as a time of detox from the desire of like material goods in favor of communication with the Almighty, with oneself, loved ones, and some good texts, perhaps?
Yes, but he wouldn't frame it that way because detox comes from the world of the therapeutic and the quasi-medical. And the concept of detox therefore would be that my health is the most important question to be discussed. And now the issue is if you do Shabbat, or some people try to sell a Jewish religious practice this way. If you shake a lulav, it's good for your muscles and your upper arms, or if you I don't know what blow the shofar, it increases your lung capacity. This is a way of making the value proposition of Judaism again into a kind of a commodity, into a kind of a thing that you sell. And if you believe the theory, then you buy the product, and if you don't buy the product. Heschel is trying to point to a set of values which are not all to be understood in terms of influences and consumer goods to be bought and sold. And Shabbat is indeed an institution which allows us, if we take it seriously, to yes, to rebalance, yes, to detox. But I still think that if he were having this conversation with you, he would balk a little bit at the kind of therapeutic language. He's nothing against people being healthy. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But turning that into a kind of idolatry is not something he would have appreciated.
I see. How would you say is relevant this interpretation of Shabbat today?
Well, I think it's only becoming more relevant. He wrote it, remember, in the immediate post-war era, when the world, I always think of, TV shows like Mad Men and all the rest of it, which talk about 1950s America, where there's a great boom in consumer goods and the world is pulling out of the strictures of the Second World War. And now it's spend, 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 and advance yourself and get a career and all the rest of it. And actually, what's happened in the 70 and more years that have passed since is that our economies and our technologies are increasingly encouraging us to achieve more, to spend more, to get better, to go farther. I suppose there is a generational shift, actually. It may be that for a younger generation, what Heschel is talking about in his prizing of some things that go beyond those values, that those ideas may actually resonate even more. So, as a matter of fact, it's a book that hasn't gone out of print. It continues to be translated into a number of different languages. It continues to resonate with new generations of readers.
So, would you say that during the week, the work days, each of us is a doer, and a part of that maybe uh, reality of going further and doing better? And what word would or words would define a Jew on Shabbat?
Well, if doing is the definition of the 6 days of the week, then being would be the verb that comes to mind for the seventh day. We do things. You've heard about all that kiddush and all that whiskey. That depends which tradition you're part of and how you choose to spend Shabbat. Of course, one does do activities, and there's quite a lot of physical activity before Shabbat. You and I are having this conversation on Friday afternoon, and I am conscious of the fact that I've got to go downstairs and get everything ready, help my wife at least get everything ready for the guests who are coming and the Shabbat that is ahead of us. So it's not that you lie there in a kind of a coma, but Shabbat is about being, it's about the joy of family and friends. It's about prayer and study, if that's what you enjoy doing. Heschel made a distinction between joy and leisure or fun. There's nothing wrong with having fun on Shabbat, but the joy of Shabbat is not necessarily to be understood simply as a leisure activity, another thing. We've also commodified our leisure, and we've turned all the, our fun activities are things that we buy and sell on the market. And Heschel would encourage us, again, I would add, it's not so much a question if you are Orthodox or Reform or secular or whatever you are, but to find a Shabbat practice and a rhythm of life which encourages you, which enables you to be rather than to do, at least for that one day of the week.
That's a great answer. Um, Abraham Joseph Heschel's life is a remarkable blend of strong Jewish identity and also civic engagement. He actively opposed America's war in Vietnam and was friends with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Is it true that Dr. King was invited to Heschel's family Passover Seder?
It is true, yes. Had King not been assassinated when he was, I guess, in 68, he, by all accounts, would have been a guest, he and his wife, at the Heschel family in New York. So, yes, they were closely connected to each other, and they worked closely both in the civil rights movement, in the opposition to policies which discriminate against the Black Americans, but also, and more controversially, in fact, in opposing American involvement in the Vietnam War. Heschel was quite instrumental, we believe, in encouraging Dr. King, to take a stance on the war. He was not sure whether that would help or hinder the cause of the civil rights movement.
Interesting. Now, shifting a little bit to um Vatican and more interfaith.
Mhm.
60 years ago, the Second Vatican Council adopted the Declaration of Nostra Aetate. The Catholic Church removed or amended passages from its liturgy that disparaged Jews or mentioned the expected conversion of the Jewish people to Christianity.
Mhm.
What influence did Herschel, as a representative of American Jews, have on these decisions?
Daniel, it's Heschel, not Herschel. That's a different
Heschel.
name.
Heschel.
Heschel.
Yes, I
There's no
apologize.
R in his name. Um, Abraham Joshua Heschel was a significant Jewish participant in the theological discourse that preceded the promulgation, the writing of Nostra Aetate, that declaration, which indeed we've been marking 60 years since its publication. There were other Jews involved, particularly in the if you like, the sort of diplomacy aspect. But Heschel, who had a strong connection with Cardinal Bea, who was a significant figure in Catholic thought and public life at the time, Heschel was invited to Rome, participated in conversations, including intimate conversations with the Pope of the time. He was a major Jewish interlocutor in the discourse which led to the breakthrough of that Vatican declaration.
Thank you so much. That's interesting how Jewish, specifically Heschel, and Jewish influence overall influenced Nostra Aetate. Um, there is much talk these days about hate speech amplified by speedy internet and modern technology. What language did Heschel speak when fostering interfaith relations? What values guided him?
Good question. I think he spoke the language of shared faith. Heschel made a distinction between creed and faith. Creed is the particular set of beliefs, institutionalized or an integrated declaration of beliefs. And there are different creeds, but he believed in faith that was kind of prior to all of our intellectual constructs, even prior to our cultural milieu, so that faith is something that happens to individuals, and that sense of a commonality, a universality, can provide a language for finding real discourse. Heschel was always very comfortable talking, for example, to people of different faith traditions who pray seriously. He took prayer very seriously, much more than a kind of mechanical fulfillment of his responsibilities. It's worth remembering that Abraham Joshua Heschel was born to very significant Hasidic dynasties, both on his mother's and his father's side, and he himself was a great Hasidic soul, really, who decided not to stay within that world. And to some degree, a wider society was his kind of Hasidic court, and he never presented himself as a Rebbe, but he was a kind of Rebbe to that court. And I mentioned this because I think that the rich background of piety and devotion, which he came from, gave him a real respect for those with a different tradition of piety and devotion. It's an interesting question also how he found a common language, not with people who professed other faiths, but of what you might call principled non-believers, those who adopt a position of agnostic or atheistic and so forth. And Heschel wasn't always so easy for him to find a common language with those folks. But from his earliest times, just from the time growing up in kind of cosmopolitan Warsaw, where he's mixing with Zionists and non-Zionists or anti-Zionists, with some socialists, with lots of different Orthodox folks, a range of different opinions, he is, I think, quite used to juggling that. Now, language is a good way of thinking about Heschel. He himself was creative in 4 languages, even though he was born in Poland. Polish was not really one of them. We have very little of Heschel in Polish, but Yiddish, Hebrew, German, and English. And in each of those languages, he achieved an extremely high level of facility, a kind of a poetic ease in which he could express himself. He published, as a young man, a book of Yiddish poetry of his, and continued in his writing to find a real capacity to find imagery and language. Some people find it a bit too rich, and it gives them a kind of spiritual indigestion. But for many readers, the way he writes and the way he would speak in public was very compelling.
Thank you so much. I want to go a little bit further with the analogy of the languages. People speak different languages, and all attempts to create a universal language, from the Tower of Babel to Zamenhof's efforts to create Esperanto to make it popular, really have failed. How can we develop a common language to build bridges of understanding and friendship between different people and different religions?
Well, it is true. I mean, Zamenhof and Esperanto is in many ways a beautiful and tragic story of this attempt. One thinks earlier in the dawn of modernity, Descartes and other philosophers were convinced that mathematics would be this universal language. And indeed, today in our digital era, there's all kinds of questions about whether the way we currently use and write language, whether that will all change, whether it's going to be novels written in emojis and so forth as we go forward. I don't pretend to know what's going to happen in that case. I think that the best we can actually try to do is inhabit our own languages as richly and as profoundly as we can. I've recently published a book called Living the Letters, which is a kind of theological book of my own, and it's based around the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And it involves each little chapter it has at its heart a theme, which is a word or a phrase in Hebrew. And the first one begins with Aleph, and it goes through Bet Gimel and so forth through the alphabet. Um, there's a story I tell at the beginning of the book, which appears in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Shabbat, where some kids come up with a way of remembering the alphabet, but also learning ethical and moral values as they go along. So Aleph Bet, they say, stands for Elaf Binah, learn wisdom. And Gimel Dalet stands for Gemol Dalim, support the weak. And Hey Vav, Ho is one of the names of God. So you had intellectual endeavor, social responsibility, religious quest, and that's just the first six letters. And so what I like about that story so much is that you're doing two things. You are learning Aleph Bet, a particular embodied specific cultural language, but at the same time you're trying to inculcate ways, positive ways, important ways of being in the world. So I don't think, to answer your question, Daniel, we can try to guess what enormous technological changes. This is a popular sport at the moment. Will AI take all of our jobs away? In 10 years' time, when this podcast version of this podcast is happening, it will be two computers speaking to each other. I mean, all of these things are possible. We don't know. There have often been apocalyptic fears and concerns about what's going to happen. I remember the fact that in the classical Greek period, there was a lot of suspicion about writing and alphabets. Plato writes about this. The idea that once you have the use of alphabets, it will be the death of all real learning. Why? Because learning happens when one person is in contact with another. But when you have language, when you have written language, alphabets, you can go away, read by yourself. You lose the immediacy of the learning moment. Well, what happened in the end, of course, was that alphabets and the printing press and all the rest of it, they weren't only bad news for learning. They also had a few advantages. You and I both have pictures of books behind our heads. Whether or not they're real, I think my ones are actually really books. You can touch them. I don't know whether you got behind you,
No,
but
the
the
screen.
fact that they are the decoration that we choose to show suggests that books evoke or represent, not only the loss of wisdom but the ambition to gain wisdom. So I don't pretend to be able to predict what's going to happen in our crazy and rapidly changing world. But my own instinct is to go deeper, to dig deeper into our own languages, our own alphabets, our own cultures, our own traditions, and to seek within them not some kind of archaeological, a reproduction of a former age, but how we can find ways of living in our age that are informed by that quest.
Interesting. I have a question that I often ask during the interview. So here's the question.
Okay.
If you had the opportunity to ask God one question, what would that question be?
If I had the opportunity to ask God one question, what would the question be? Well, I'm going to escape your question a little bit by again invoking Heschel, who you were talking about before. Heschel was aware of the fact that most of us, when we talk about God, think of ourselves as the subject and God as the object. So we are searching for God, right? In a grammatical sentence, the subject, I went to the shop, okay, or I gave Susan some bread. I am the subject, okay, and Susan is the object. The bread is also the object, but that's complicated, okay? Heschel says no. Actually, that's why he called his most famous book "God in Search of Man." God is the subject of the sentence, and we are the object of God. God is. It's not that we are asking God a question; it's that God is constantly asking us questions. Questions like "Ayeka," where are you? Are you taking responsibility for the times you live in and the deeds that are perpetrated in your name and the great things that are happening around you, but the dreadful things that are happening around you too. So if I think if it's not too if you don't find it too much of an escapist answer, I think that if I had one question to ask God, I would say, what is it you want to ask of me?
I think that's a great answer, and I think that's a very important question we can all ask. I want to thank you so much for your time and the great opportunity to learn from you. תודה
It's a
רבה.
pleasure. It's a pleasure, Daniel. I'm delighted that you're doing this podcast. I'm sure there are millions of people who are following it every week. And even if they're not yet millions, the fact that you're doing this is tremendous. And I wish you lots of luck. And in the spirit of Heschel on a Friday afternoon, I wish you Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom to you as well. And I want to say to my viewers, thank you so much for watching my channel. Please react to the podcast. All reactions are very welcome and they're very important to me. See you soon on the podcast, Keeping the Faith.